The morning began with calm efficiency inside the towering glass headquarters, yet the illusion shattered when red warning lights pulsed across the executive screens. Richard Hale said, "What is this chaos? My company was stable last night." The boardroom erupted with ringing phones, frantic assistants, and a flood of alerts pouring through every device. Cynthia Moore said, "Richard, the media has broken a scandal before we even saw the numbers." Every breath carried tension as faces turned pale and loyalties instantly blurred. The company's reputation hung on a thread, while rivals outside sharpened their claws. Richard Hale said, "I built this empire on power and trust, and now I feel it slipping like sand through my hands." Each voice added to the uproar until even silence became a casualty. The CEO, once unshakable, now felt abandoned under the glaring fluorescent lights. In that single rupture, trust evaporated, survival became the only currency, and betrayal was no longer distant speculation, it was alive in the room. The silence after the chaos was almost unbearable as Richard Hale sat back, his breath uneven, every sound amplified. Cynthia Moore said, "They want you out before the market even opens." Richard Hale stared at her, his pride fractured. The weight of decades of ruthless ambition now turned against him in a single morning. He saw betrayal not as theory but as presence, alive in the eyes of those around him. Every whisper from the board echoed like a blade scraping against steel. Richard Hale said, "They think I will surrender, but they don't know what I've survived." Yet the fear of the unknown seeped in, feeding on the fragile edges of his control. The boardroom had transformed from sanctuary to cage, and trust had become his most dangerous weakness. The screens kept flashing, each headline a reminder of collapse. Richard Hale whispered, "It's all unraveling faster than I imagined." Cynthia Moore said, "The investors smell blood, and they'll circle like sharks." He felt every second close in on him, as if the walls pressed tighter. Years of command had left him strong, but unprepared for betrayal this deep. His reflection in the polished table was unrecognizable, eyes filled with rage and despair. He thought of every hand he had shaken, every promise broken, and how each thread stitched this downfall. The betrayal burned sharper because it was intimate, carved out by those he had trusted the most. Time slowed as the boardroom doors opened. Executives streamed in, faces cold and unreadable. Richard Hale said, "You vultures smell opportunity in every scar." One man muttered, "It's survival, not malice." He felt each step of theirs an invasion into his domain. Cynthia Moore placed a hand on his shoulder, but her touch was a reminder that alliances were as brittle as glass. The air reeked of shifting loyalties. He wondered how many of them had known, how many had planned this downfall. Richard Hale said, "I built this empire, and you think you'll dismantle it in one morning?" Yet doubt gnawed beneath his words. The whispers became louder, feeding on his silence. Richard Hale said, "Every empire crumbles from within, not without." Cynthia Moore looked at him sharply, sensing his words carried more than anger. They carried prophecy. The phones still rang, screens still glared, but the real battle was not outside. It was in this room, against unseen daggers cloaked in loyalty. His chest tightened with rage, but his voice hardened with defiance. Richard Hale said, "If betrayal is alive here, then I will drag it into the light." Every face turned toward him, some with pity, some with calculation. The betrayal had only just begun. The pressure had not eased. It had only sharpened overnight. Richard Hale said, "Every headline makes me bleed a little more." Cynthia Moore said, "The rival CEO has already positioned himself for your fall." He felt the world circling closer, a noose of whispered betrayals. Richard Hale walked across the dimmed boardroom, dragging his hand along the glass wall, as though feeling the cold bite of failure. His empire was no longer steady. It was trembling under suspicion. Cynthia Moore said, "We have no allies strong enough to withstand this storm unless you strike first." His voice carried fury, but also exhaustion when he whispered, "If they want war, then I'll bring fire to their doorstep." Yet even as he spoke, He felt the tremor of paranoia crawling through his skin. Trust was gone. Safety was gone. All that remained was survival, and survival demanded sacrifice. Morning arrived, but instead of clarity, it brought new storms. Richard Hale entered the trading floor, greeted by chaos. Screens screamed red with plunging numbers. Richard Hale said, "They want to see me fall in public, humiliated before my own people." Cynthia Moore said, "You must not let them see you break." He clenched his fists as he walked through rows of stunned employees. Each glance was a dagger, each whisper proof of doubt. He wondered how many still believed in him, how many had already chosen the rival. His empire had become a battlefield, and every desk a trench. He muttered, "If betrayal lurks in my own ranks, I'll drag it into the light." But the fear in his chest did not leave. It only pressed harder, like a hand closing around his heart. That afternoon, Richard Hale faced the board. Their eyes were knives, sharp and ready to cut. One executive said, "Your failure is costing us everything." Richard Hale slammed his fist and said, "Failure? I see only cowards waiting for scraps." Cynthia Moore said, "Enough, both of you." But the tension had grown monstrous, feeding on fear. The board no longer looked at him as a leader, but as prey. He scanned the faces and realized trust was dead in this room. Every ally was a potential enemy. Every nod was a lie waiting to strike. Richard Hale said, "This company will not survive if you all keep tearing it apart." Yet even his words felt hollow, swallowed by a silence heavy with betrayal. The room belonged to no one anymore. Later that night, Richard Hale stood alone in his office, the city lights sprawling beneath him. He whispered, "The empire I built now trembles beneath betrayal." Cynthia Moore entered, her voice hushed but urgent. Cynthia Moore said, "We need to prepare for a direct strike from your rival." He turned, eyes blazing but weary, and muttered, "Let him come." The silence between them spoke louder than words, thick with the knowledge that loyalty was not guaranteed. He no longer asked who might betray him. He asked instead who had not yet done it. The shadows in his office felt alive, whispering with secrets. Richard Hale said, "I have faced rivals before, but never ghosts within my own walls." His reflection in the glass window showed not a conqueror, but a man cornered by betrayal. The following morning, Richard Hale addressed his top executives in the conference hall. Richard Hale said, "We stand on the edge of collapse, but collapse is not destiny." Cynthia Moore whispered to him, "They doubt you more each day." His eyes swept the room, reading each silent betrayal written in their expressions. He raised his voice, commanding, "If you still believe in this company, then stand with me. If not, get out now." The silence that followed was heavier than any words spoken. No one moved. No one stood. Betrayal had already taken root too deep, and loyalty had grown fragile. He felt his chest tighten again, realizing that his empire had transformed into a battlefield without soldiers. Richard Hale said, "Then I fight alone." The words echoed like steel against stone, but even steel cracks under enough pressure. The storm of suspicion grew heavier as Richard Hale sought comfort in the one person who still seemed loyal. He sat across from his CFO, Daniel Cross, in a dim office lined with glowing monitors. Richard Hale said, "Daniel, you have been my anchor through every storm." Daniel Cross, calm and measured, replied, "I will never abandon you, Richard. This company is ours to protect." Richard felt a flicker of relief, though the shadows whispered warnings. Cynthia Moore entered silently, her expression wary. Cynthia Moore said, "Trust is a dangerous luxury now." Richard looked between them, torn between loyalty and doubt. Daniel Cross leaned forward and whispered, "Your enemies are circling, but I can shield you from their knives." Richard nodded, but the tremor in his heart grew stronger. The thought gnawed at him. Sometimes betrayal wears the mask of loyalty until the final strike. The next morning, whispers filled the cafeteria as Richard Hale walked through. He caught fragments of conversations. Every word. a dagger. Employee voices carried blame, fear, and doubt. One said, "The CEO is finished." Another muttered, "The rival already controls the market." Richard clenched his jaw, feeling every gaze pierce him. Cynthia Moore said, "You cannot ignore the voices. They feed the fire of betrayal." Richard slammed his tray down and growled, "Let them doubt. I will not fall by whispers." But inside, his chest ached with rage and humiliation. He scanned the faces and wondered who among them was already feeding information to his enemies. Trust was ashes and every glance was poison. That afternoon, the shadow investor's voice echoed over the phone. Richard Hale said, "You have stayed in the shadows long enough." "Why now?" The voice replied, cold and distant, "Because weakness draws predators, and you reek of it." Cynthia Moore tightened her grip on the receiver, her expression dark. Cynthia Moore said, "This is blackmail, not partnership." Richard's hands shook as he whispered, "You built me to survive storms, not drown in them." The voice chuckled, "Survival demands sacrifice, and you must decide who you sacrifice." Richard slammed the phone down, his heart pounding with dread. The unseen strings pulled tighter. Every deal, every alliance, every promise felt like a chain dragging him closer to collapse. He realized his enemies were not just in front of him, but behind every curtain. The old mentor, Harold Kent, returned for a visit. Once a powerful CEO, now retired, he stood in Richard's office with a solemn gaze. Harold Kent said, "I warned you long ago that ambition consumes all it touches." Richard Hale said, "And I ignored you because I thought I was different." Cynthia Moore stood nearby, silent but listening closely. Harold Kent said, "Trust is a poison in this world. It feeds you until it kills you." Richard lowered his head, whispering, "And now it bleeds me dry." Harold's eyes softened, yet his tone was sharp. Harold Kent said, "You must decide if your legacy is survival or ruin, because both paths demand blood." Richard clenched his fists, knowing the truth carried more weight than comfort. The lesson of betrayal was never free. Later that night, Richard Hale walked the empty corridors of his company, his footsteps echoing against marble floors. He thought of every ally and every betrayal yet to be revealed. Cynthia Moore said, "You are chasing ghosts, some wounds you cannot see until they cut you." Richard said, "Then I will force the truth into the light, even if it blinds me." The silence of the hall carried the weight of a graveyard. Shadows flickered under the dim lights as if mocking him. His reflection in the glass walls looked more like a stranger than a leader. Richard whispered, "If betrayal is alive among us, it breathes my air and walks my halls." He clenched his fists, his fury burning hotter than his fear. The battle had moved beyond boardrooms. It now haunted his very soul. The rival made his move with ruthless precision. Victor Grant, the rival CEO, launched a media strike so devastating that Richard Hale felt its echo in every corner of his empire. Richard Hale said, "He wants not just my company but my name destroyed." Cynthia Moore said, "Victor feeds on your weakness, and he's winning the board with promises you can't counter." Richard slammed his fist on the table, veins bulging. Victor's voice on the news declared, "A broken empire deserves new leadership." The sting of humiliation cut deep. Richard whispered, "This is no longer competition, this is war." His eyes burned with fury as he realized the battlefield had shifted from the boardroom to the public stage. He could feel his empire collapsing under Victor's carefully orchestrated assault, and every ally wavered on the brink of betrayal. Richard Hale stormed into the boardroom where whispers had already poisoned the air. The directors sat in silence, their expressions cold, distant, unreadable. Richard Hale said, "You sit here measuring profit while my name is burned alive." One director muttered, "Victor has stability, you have scandal." Cynthia Moore leaned forward, her voice sharp. Cynthia Moore said, "You forget who built this empire you now doubt." But the directors did not flinch. The silence spoke louder than loyalty. Richard's pulse thundered in his temples as he shouted, Do you dare betray me in my own house? The room stiffened, eyes darting, but no one spoke. Betrayal was not spoken aloud, but its scent hung thick in the air. The boardroom had become a coliseum, and Richard felt like the cornered gladiator awaiting the final blow. The underdog appeared where no one expected. Sarah Blake, a junior executive dismissed as unimportant, presented numbers that shocked the room. Sarah Blake said, "The collapse can be slowed, but only if strategies change now." Richard Hale studied her, stunned by her composure. Cynthia Moore whispered, "She is the voice they will follow if you fail." Richard felt both admiration and threat in her rise. He said, "Do you seek to save my empire or to take it?" Sarah Blake answered calmly, "I seek survival, and survival demands strength." The board shifted uneasily, their loyalties flickering like candles. Richard realized in that moment that the battlefield had grown more unpredictable, with power rising in unexpected hands. He muttered, "Even shadows can grow teeth." That evening, Richard Hale sat in his office, the city lights glaring like hostile eyes. Cynthia Moore stood near the window, her reflection split across the glass. Cynthia Moore said, "They will not stand with you, Richard. Their loyalty is already gone." Richard leaned back, his hands trembling slightly. He said, "Then I will stand alone." Cynthia's face softened but carried sorrow. Cynthia Moore said, "No one survives this alone, not even you." Richard whispered, "I have survived every storm, every dagger, every betrayal." His words sounded strong, but inside he knew they were fragile. The city outside roared with life, but within the walls, silence ruled like a ghost. He could almost feel Victor's shadow stretching into his sanctuary. Betrayal had moved from whispers into full invasion, and he knew the war was only beginning. The next day, the war exploded publicly. Victor Grant appeared at a live press conference, declaring a hostile bid for Richard's empire. Reporters crowded, cameras flashing. Victor Grant said, "This company deserves leadership untainted by scandal." Richard Hale watched from a distant monitor, fury in his veins. Richard said, "He has turned my empire into his stage." Cynthia Moore said, "The people are already listening to him, Richard." Every word cuts deeper than silence. Richard leaned forward, whispering, "If this is the game, then I will not surrender. I will burn the board before he takes it." His eyes burned with fire, but his heart pounded with fear. For the first time, he knew that the war was no longer his to control. The betrayal had grown into something larger than him. He whispered, "This is not just my downfall, it is my reckoning." The boardroom was silent, thick with tension as Richard Hale studied the faces around him. He sensed the betrayal tightening like a net. Richard Hale said, "I know someone in this room is carving the dagger meant for my back." Cynthia Moore whispered, "The signs point everywhere, Richard, and nowhere." The directors avoided his eyes, their expressions cold masks hiding poison. Richard stood tall, but his heart thundered with unease. He recalled every closed-door conversation, every false smile. His empire had become a stage, and he was the last man unaware of the script. Richard Hale said, "I built this company with iron and fire, and I will expose whoever sold it for ashes." Yet, even as he spoke, he felt the first crack of certainty break inside him. Betrayal was not coming, it was already here. That evening, Richard summoned Daniel Cross to his private office. Richard Hale said, "Daniel, I have trusted you with more than numbers. I trusted you with my empire." Daniel Cross replied calmly, "And I have never betrayed that trust." Yet his eyes betrayed no warmth, only calculation. Cynthia Moore lingered in the corner, her expression unreadable. Richard leaned closer and whispered, "The walls are bleeding with secrets, and I feel your shadow in them." Daniel said, "Paranoia is a dangerous companion, Richard." The words cut deeper than knives. For the first time, Richard felt true fear, not of enemies outside, but of betrayal inside his sanctuary. His empire no longer trembled from rivals alone. It trembled from within. The next morning, An anonymous leak struck headlines, confidential documents revealing Richard's darkest deals. He knew only someone close could have unleashed it. Richard Hale said, "Only my inner circle had access." Cynthia Moore slammed her hand on the desk and said, "Then the traitor sits among us." Executives stared at each other, the silence loud with suspicion. Richard's mind raced, seeing betrayal etched in every familiar face. He said, "I will not fall to whispers, I will drag the liar into the light." Yet the more he spoke, the weaker his voice felt, as though the betrayal had already won. His empire bled in the press, and the dagger twisted deeper with every headline. Trust was now not a shield, but the weapon used to destroy him. That evening, the confrontation erupted. Richard Hale stood face to face with Daniel Cross in the dim boardroom. Richard Hale said, "It was you. Every leak, every dagger, they trace back to your hand." Daniel Cross smiled faintly, his eyes cold. Daniel said, "I gave you loyalty for years, but your empire became a prison. I want freedom, and I want power." Cynthia Moore gasped, her face pale with disbelief. Richard's chest tightened as fury surged through him. Richard said, "You were the one I trusted most, and you shattered it for greed." Daniel replied, "Not greed, Richard. Survival." The words cut deeper than any betrayal before. In that moment, Richard knew the battle was lost, not to his rival, but to the man he had once called brother. The room erupted in silence after the revelation, a silence heavier than any storm. Richard Hale said, "You were not just my CFO. You were my friend, my brother." Daniel Cross replied coldly, "And that is why the dagger cuts so deep." Cynthia Moore said, "You destroyed him, Daniel. You destroyed us all." Richard's body shook with rage and despair. He whispered, "I gave you everything, and you turned it into my ruin." Daniel's eyes remained void, without regret. The betrayal was complete, brutal, irreversible. Richard felt the last thread of trust snap inside him. His empire was not stolen. It was handed over by the one he trusted most. And in that moment, Richard realized the cost of ambition was not just empire, it was his soul. The board met without mercy, their judgment swift and merciless. Richard Hale said, "You sit here ready to carve my legacy into pieces." Cynthia Moore whispered, "Richard, they've already chosen Daniel." The directors' voices thundered like a verdict. One declared, "Your scandal has weakened us beyond repair." Another added, "Leadership must change for survival." Richard's fists trembled, rage boiling, but his voice cracked as he said, "I bled for this empire, and you sell it for scraps." The silence that followed was colder than rejection. It was execution. The gavel fell, and Richard knew the empire was slipping from his grasp. The betrayal was complete, public, irreversible. He was no longer a leader. He was prey abandoned to the wolves. The news spread instantly, cameras flashing as Richard stumbled out of headquarters. Reporters shouted questions like daggers. "Mr. Hale, did you lie to your investors? Is Daniel Cross the true leader now?" Richard said nothing, his silence heavier than words. Cynthia Moore shielded him, whispering, "Ignore them. Their hunger is for your fall." Richard's chest tightened, his steps unsteady. Each flash burned his face, 1,000 bright scars of humiliation. He whispered, "They no longer see me as a leader. They see me as a corpse still walking." The crowd swarmed closer, their voices swelling into a storm. The empire had cast him aside, and now the world feasted on his ruin. That night, Richard sat alone in his penthouse, the city sprawling like a graveyard of neon. He whispered, "The empire is gone, but its shadow haunts me." Cynthia Moore sat opposite, eyes filled with sorrow. Cynthia Moore said, "You gave them everything, and they repaid you with daggers." Richard stared into his glass of whiskey, the liquid trembling in his hand. He said, "Daniel took what I built," and the board applauded. Silence stretched between them, heavy as stone. The city beyond glittered, but within the room only despair remained. He muttered, "I was king of glass towers, and now I am a ghost in my own empire." Cynthia placed her hand on his, but even her touch could not silence the storm inside. The underdog, Sarah Blake, now stood before the board, her voice steady. Sarah Blake said, "Richard Hale's downfall is proof of fragility. I will not let this empire fall again." Richard watched from a distance, his chest tightening with bitter awe. Cynthia Moore whispered, "She rises where you fell, Richard." His fists clenched, but he did not move. Sarah's words struck like knives, not with malice, but with certainty. Sarah Blake said, "Survival belongs to those unafraid to break old idols." Richard's reflection in the glass wall beside him looked shattered, the image of a king dethroned. He whispered, "They have chosen their new savior, and I am the relic left behind." The taste of ash filled his throat, heavy with loss. The retired mentor Harold Kent found Richard in the deserted lobby. Harold Kent said, "I told you ambition devours its own children." Richard replied, "I thought I was untouchable, but I was just the hungriest prey." Cynthia Moore stood nearby, silent, her face heavy with grief. Harold Kent said, "You mistook trust for strength, and it left you bare." Richard's eyes filled with fire and despair. He whispered, "Then I will carry this ruin as my crown." Harold placed a hand on his shoulder, his gaze filled with sorrow. Harold Kent said, "Survival now is not about empire. It is about yourself." Richard nodded weakly, his body shaking. The empire was gone, but the weight of betrayal remained etched into his soul. The empire was no longer his. Richard Hale walked through the empty halls of the building he once ruled. His footsteps echoed like mourning bells. Richard Hale whispered, "These walls carried my victories, and now they hold only ghosts." Cynthia Moore followed in silence, her eyes heavy with sorrow. She said, "It was not the empire that betrayed you, Richard. It was the people you trusted most." His hands brushed across the cold glass walls, each reflection showing a broken man where once stood a king. He said, "I gave them fire, and they left me in ashes." The silence pressed like a weight against his chest. Every step deeper into the hollow halls was another step into the graveyard of his ambition. The empire was gone, but the echoes would haunt him forever. Outside, the company banners were lowered and replaced. Richard stood across the street, watching his name stripped from the glass tower. His chest ached as though each letter torn away was carved into his heart. Richard Hale whispered, "My name once crowned this empire. Now it's erased like it never existed." Cynthia Moore stood beside him, silent, knowing no words could soothe such wounds. The crowd cheered faintly as Victor Grant appeared in the distance, shaking hands with Daniel Cross. Richard's jaw tightened, his silence louder than fury. He whispered, "They celebrate my ruin as if it were their triumph." The tower no longer belonged to him. His legacy had been sold, buried, and replaced before his eyes. Betrayal was complete, and it wore a smile. Later that night, Richard sat alone at a bar far from the city lights. The glass in his hand trembled as he stared into its depths. He whispered, "I was betrayed by my own blood of trust." The bartender avoided his gaze, sensing the storm in his silence. Cynthia Moore found him there, her face weary but still loyal. She said, "You are not finished, Richard. You live, and that is enough for now." He shook his head, his eyes burning with both grief and defiance. Richard Hale said, "To live after this is not survival, it is punishment." The neon lights flickered across his face, painting him in fractured colors. He felt both alive and dead at once, chained to the memory of what was stolen. His crown was gone, but his rage remained. The mentor, Harold Kent, met Richard one final time. They stood on the rooftop, the city below alive with indifferent lights. Harold Kent said, "Empires end, but men carry their ruins longer than stone." Richard replied, "I carry not ruins, Harold. I carry betrayal carved into my flesh." Harold's eyes softened, filled with sorrow. He said, "Then your true battle is not with them anymore. It is with yourself." Cynthia Moore stood near the edge, gazing at the skyline. She whispered, "The world moves on, Richard, whether you heal or not." Richard gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He said, "The world may move on, but I remain chained to its betrayal." The night air was sharp, and the silence between them was endless. At dawn, Richard walked alone down the street as the city awoke. The sky glowed with pale gold, but his eyes held only shadows. He whispered, "I am not a king, not a leader, not even a man untouched. I am the betrayed, and that is what I will always be." The street was empty, his footsteps the only sound. He carried no briefcase, no crown, no empire, only the silence of loss. Cynthia Moore watched from afar, her face streaked with tears. She whispered, "Even in ruin, he is still Richard Hale." Yet she knew the man she followed was no longer whole. Richard stopped at a corner, staring into the distance. His final words drifted into the dawn air. "This is not an ending. This is the beginning of my curse." The city moved on, but Richard stood still, a monument to betrayal.